Good afternoon. Welcome to the Midday Mull for Saturday, the 5th of February. With Robert Murray McShane, the second book that we're reading at the moment is Romans, and today we read Romans chapter 8. And I'm struck by verse 28, which links into what we saw in Job, where we see God at work, and Job had absolutely no idea. In Romans 8, we have verse 28, which is a well-known verse. It says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." In all things, God works for the good of those who love him. And that is an encouragement that as we go through life and when we're facing all sorts of trials and temptations, when we're facing disasters and we think things have gone completely wrong, we can hold on to that and say, God is working for our good. Now, we need to recognize that what we think of as good is not necessarily the way God sees things. And sometimes what God is doing for our good, we think it's a disaster. And just in human life, a parent takes a young child to be inoculated against measles. The child thinks getting this injection, the pain, the scariness, this nurse and everything, thinks this is a disaster. How can this be good for me? I'm suffering pain, it's uncomfortable, I'm scared, etc., etc. This isn't good. Whereas in actual fact, the parent is working that for the good of the child. And sometimes we've just got to realize that it's like that with God. We don't see it. We just don't get it. And that's what happened with Job. He saw his world, and his comforters just saw things from his perspective. And it didn't make sense, and it didn't fit their ideas, and it was a problem. But we hold on to the truth of Scripture, that irrespective of what our perspective is and how we feel about it, we can hang on to it and say, God, I fully believe that you're working all things for our good. We don't understand it. I don't get it. And I just trust that one day, probably only when I step into your presence in eternity, I will finally see what you're doing. But be encouraged that God does love us, that God does look after us, that God does want the best for us, and that all things are working for our good. Be encouraged. Be blessed.